Hey everyone, Dr. Tom Warcroft back here with you for this episode of the Healing from Lyme Disease Summit. And today I'm really pumped about our conversation. We're joined by Майя Шетрит, who's an MD, a great friend of mine, and someone who's a board certified pediatric neurologist who over the years we've talked at different PANS and PANDAS conferences together. But what's always so interesting is I think that when I back in medical school thought about it, I was like, I want to be a pediatric neurologist because I want to help kids. And then I was like, well, if I want to help kids, maybe I should do something a little different, because it was always so fine point, like get some crazy weird diagnosis and put them on some meds. But the difference with Maya is, she wrote a book called The Dirt Cure. She's always talking about how to really just reinvigorate self-healing, which is why she's the perfect fit for our summit here. And it's just, she's one of the people who looks at how the body traditionally has worked and really empowers me, even as a person, an individual, to go back to learn what I can learn about myself from Mother Earth, from the planet. And then she also has this amazing book coming out called The Master Plan Experience: The Science, Safety, and Sacred Ceremony of Psychedelics, and really has dove really deep into the field of just like opening our minds to the healing potential within, from looking back at really sacred medicinals that have been on the planet for probably longer than human beings. And really, one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation today with Dr. Maya is that this is so important. So many of you may be coming to the summit and someone who's sick, they get treated, they might get better, right? That's probably not most of us. We're here, people who have been stuck in a pattern of chronic illness, and they want that new, the new information that allows them to open the door to healing that may have otherwise been closed on them by the conventional medical system. So I could go on and on about Maya all day long, but I'd rather have her talk to you about herself. So Dr. Майя Шетрит, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is so exciting because we kind of were talking about what to talk about, and we're going to talk about, how plant medicine can heal our brains. And this is the part I find so interesting because when I went to college, everybody's just kind of like, you either were in the partying or you were not in the partying. And if you're in the partying, you're using maybe some things that were green and grew, or you're drinking too much. And that's not at all what we're talking about. And there's so much science about how the brain works and how all these things work together. So maybe you could just, I think it's so interesting where people come from, how they get into this, and how does someone who's a pediatric neurologist start to talk about sacred plants that can heal the human brain and the human heart?
Well, I think maybe the first thing I'll say is that for me, I talk about master plants rather than talking about psychedelics. And master plants can include any plant that is, so it's an indigenous term that refers to these teacher plants that alter us in ways that allow for us to access healing in a different way. And some master plants are something we all probably, or most of us, engage with or have engaged with. Coffee is one example of a master plant that alters us, right? And cacao, right? So if you love chocolate, you've engaged with master plants. So there's an array of master plants. And then there are this particular class of master plants that have psychedelic effects. And some of them are, psilocybe mushrooms that we call psilocybin, or ayahuasca, or San Pedro, or iboga, or many others. And I became interested. So I'm board certified in adult and child neurology. So I have the gamut, but I did focus a lot of my practice on children. And the reason I was so interested in treating children originally was because they have such plastic brains. And I thought, well, I want to work with these little people who have all this incredible potential for healing because their brains are in this very flexible time. When we talk about plastic brains or plasticity, what it means is there's a tremendous amount of potential for change, for new connections, for building new pathways. I thought, wow, this is incredible. This is what I want to do. And what I was taught actually even in my residency and my fellowship, and I mean, it wasn't recent, but it wasn't that long ago either, was that plasticity ends when we're in childhood. And at a certain point in time, we can't make new connections, we can't regenerate new pathways, et cetera, et cetera. Plasticity is like, I don't know, you hit 15, you hit 18, whatever, like there's no more of that. Everything's downhill from here. And what I learned was actually over the course of what we've all learned is that we have the capacity for plasticity well into adulthood, well into our whole lives, all the way until we die. We can create new pathways, new connections, and actually change narratives and stories. And in doing so, change our health, change our experience of life. And I mean, I can get much more into plasticity and nerd out, but that was sort of slowly kind of, started getting me exploring herbs and herbalism, and I became an herbalist. And it was actually an experience with my son who, when he was very little, he actually had mold exposure. He was my little canary in the coal mine child, and he had a mold exposure. We had to move out of our apartment in New York City. They gutted it. We got rid of all of the furniture that was upholstered. They cleaned the place with toothbrushes, the whole gamut of things. And we moved back in, and 2 weeks later, he had his first seizure in the room that originally had the mold, but it had been gutted down to the studs. And I was like, what the heck? We were doing all the things, the diet. I was already experienced in doing a lot of mind body, a lot of herbs, a lot of detox. And I was like holding my son, and I thought, wow, this is definitely not physical. This is not anything I know how to help. This is a spiritual, energetic issue. And I had no idea how to help him. Even though I was involved in the integrative community, it's just like, I didn't know who to talk to. And it took me to Ecuador. It actually took me to learning with this 4th generation shaman who was a PhD in ethnobotany. And I started to learn about master plants, not going down there to do my own ceremony or anything like that. I was just going to explore, and it took me, began a journey into this world.
Well, I think it's so interesting because you said a couple of things that just really, well, one, I mean, when it's your own son and it hits so at home, I mean, but so, you're, wow, so you certainly have the motivation, but you talk about like changing stories and then this other part of just like physical versus spiritual or energetic. And I'd love to dive into that a little bit because I think that so many people think that like their past is fixed, right? And it's like, this happened to me. And I mean, I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit because it's just, to me, it's such an important, I mean, I just hear the story being told over and over and over again. And if we have access to maybe redefining a story, I just that man, that the healing potential there seems to be massive.
Yeah, absolutely. So stories are stories. Well, I'm going to back up a little bit and talk for a minute about something called predictive coding. I'm going to nerd out for a quick moment.
So I'm going to cut you off for one sec because what's really cool is every time Maya does this, it's like the greatest, like nerding out moment ever. Like I've seen her do this in lectures and I'm just like mind blown. So have a seat and hold on because this is awesome.
Okay, that's pressure.
I love the way you nerd out, Maya.
So there's this system in the brain called the default mode network, the DMN. And the default mode network is the part of the brain. It's a constellation of areas of the brain that all work together. And it is suppressed when we are focusing on the outside world, when we need to pay attention to things around us. And it is active when we are focusing inward, right? When we have nothing to do, when we're in default mode. Okay, so that's why default mode network. And so when we're daydreaming and when we're ruminating, right, depending on how anxious we're feeling, that's when the default mode network is active. And it's kind of the me network. It's very connected to ego and our own stories of ourself and of the world around us. And one of the things that it does is something called predictive coding. And predictive coding is basically, imagine you walk into a room and you look around the room and you probably believe, if you're imagining this, that you're noticing every detail in the room. But actually, we don't, okay? Our brains are clever and good at helping us survive. And so we pick out a few details and then we fill everything else in, every other detail from what's happened to us in the past. So like I said, it's a great survival skill because, you know, you have a lion waiting to pounce on you. You don't have like 45 minutes to take in every single detail or whatever. So you say, oh, sharp teeth, you know, fierce expression, you know, big mane, whatever, and you run, right? That's what you need to do. So that's kind of like great, except if once you experience something scary like a lion in the room, you might fill in the details into all future experiences that remind you of that, remind your brain of that in some unconscious way even, and be like, oh my God, I have to be terrified every time I walk into this room because, you know, there's something that's scary, and you fill in this whole fight or flight response. So predictive coding is basically how we project the past onto the present all the time. And there's a journey in this with master plants, but that's a way, right? That stories can keep us sick. Stories can keep us sad. Stories can keep us stuck because we're living the past. We want to use our experiences to inform the present, but we don't want to be a slave to our experiences from the past. We want to be able to change our story, right? When ready, when needed. We want to use the present moment and gather new details. But sometimes our egos, right, and the default mode network really get in the way of that. So engaging with story is a really important part of healing. And I mean that literally, like telling stories, reframing stories. When I'm with people and I'm doing spiritual guidance or any kind of work with them, we always will talk about, you know, they'll say a story and I'll say, oh, like I'm interested in the language that you used to describe X. Like, what if we said it like this? How would that feel, right? And sometimes that's very healing, very shifting, very validating for them. But the other thing is that, you know, certain things, including master plants, breath work can do this, other things can do this, big experiences of awe and wonder, other things shut down our default mode network for a period of time. What that means is in those moments, you can see all the details of the present moment. So psychedelics do that, breath work, sensory deprivation, very serious meditators can do this, near-death experiences can do this. I don't necessarily recommend, but it does happen. And even like extreme sports, right? There's a whole array of things that actually help shut down the default mode network temporarily. And in those moments, we see all these new details that are of the present moment, and it helps us recalibrate those old stories that have kept us sick, sad, stuck, where we can actually build new stories and live into them. Because our bodies are listening to these stories. They're in some way in service to our stories. And that's not to say, oh, just change your story and, you know, if only you could, right? It's not, this is the conundrum, this is the puzzle of being human. It's not, we're all in it, right? We all do this in our various ways, but it is a way that I've seen tremendous healing from all kinds of intractable conditions.
So the thing I think about, and I love the way you touch on it, is like a lot of us are like, hey, have that positive mindset. You know, and I even tell people like, hey, just take like the whole day and write down what you say about yourself the most. And really within 10 minutes, everybody's already bored of it and done and very sad because it's that repetitive story. But I mean, it sounds like there are processes that allow you to access to rewriting story maybe a little bit more easily, shall I say? And, you know, and within that kind of like, what is the role of guides? Because I hear a lot about ceremony. I hear a lot about like guides, and there's like, you know, we've got a lot of coaches these days, and there's a lot of coaches listening. And I think there's a difference between a physician and a healer, right? And a physician who is a healer. And I think there's a difference between a coach and a guide. But, and that's just me, not you, obviously. But what's the role? Like, what are the better ways to access healing from story? And then, you know, are there situations that are better for doing so?
I mean, yeah. So the first thing I thought of when you were saying this about telling ourselves our stories is like I will have my students that train with me write love letters to themselves or lists of 100 things they love about themselves. Um, or we go into
Mm.
the mirror and do a bunch of things talking to ourselves. So you know, it's that there are powerful ways into changing our stories, definitely, without the need of anything that alters us in any dramatic way. But I do always think that having a guide is incredibly important. And certainly, I'm not sure if you were referring to master plants themselves in terms of engaging with those in any capacity, but I do definitely always recommend having guides for any kind of such experience. And that's not a given. So that's why I'm saying it, you know, assuming where you are, it's accessible and legal or at least decriminalized, right? Where there's sort of permission around, you know, and I'm not only talking about big macro dosing experiences where it's like the psychedelics and the colors are tripping or anything like that. I think microdosing is very potent, and we can talk about that, especially for Lyme, actually. And quantum dosing, I think quantum dosing, you know, is a whole different way of engaging in a vibrational way with these teacher plants. So I'm not necessarily even saying, oh, like you need a guide for a macro dose experience only. I think guides just help us find our way because it's hard to find your way out of your own old stories. Just, you know, even to have someone kind of hold you accountable or to bounce things off of, or, you know, so I do think that's incredibly important. Um, and especially in an experience where you're going to become very vulnerable, you absolutely must have a guide and someone who's certified. We actually are opening applications for a training program for professionals who want that vocabulary and understanding of science, safety, sacred ceremony, right? In terms of engaging with these kinds of plants. So absolutely, you do want guides, and you do want to make sure that your team, to your point of our doctors healers, right, or our right, and that whole issue, which really is an issue. I don't, you know, and I want to just say, like, your doctor doesn't have to be like a, you know, la 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 healer. They just have to have a healing presence for you. So if and that goes for all of us, is like they don't have to be super holistic. They don't have, it's just if you feel, if you're, and this is documented, right? When we look at the placebo effect and the nocebo, which is the opposite effect, we know that the relationship you have with your team is probably the most important medicine you can get. Antibiotics, herbs, all that stuff aside, all of the different possible therapies, and I'm not saying those aren't incredibly important when they're, you know, used correctly. And this goes for, you know, you said ceremony, right? This goes for sacred plants as well. To me, the ceremony is the medicine. So it's the container that really is the most healing. Like our bodies and our minds and our hearts are incredible. They have, they are intelligent and they want to heal. This is a true thing. I know for people who are chronically ill, and I've seen some of the very sickest adults and kids from around the world over my years of practice. The bodies and brains and hearts do want to heal, but it's just like finding the container that allows that to happen.
You know, it's so funny, as I tried to formulate a question that was like even coherent, I really felt like I couldn't, but you just really touched on exactly what I was trying to get to. Because I was kind of like, it's not always about just like, you know, going to do your MDMA trip, which is, you know, different than plants, but and getting all psychedelic and having somebody land you and then having integration for, there's a time and a place. But to me, it's like when I always try to say create a self-healing ritual and stuff. And then when I hear you talk about ceremony, I, you know, like literally, like, I mean, I know we'll talk about quantum dosing, but like I talk to people, whether they're drinking water or eating their food or putting something in their bed, or going to bed earlier
Mm.
and not turning the TV on or turning it off. Because so many people get pill fatigue and treatment fatigue. I'm like, you are so worthy. Your body and your mind and your heart want to heal. So just give yourself credit for actually, like, make every moment that you're doing something for yourself as sacred. And it's just like, I don't know, I just was so inspired from previous conversations and lectures I've seen where it's like, I think there's so much more sacred in our lives than we give ourselves credit for.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I mean, this is a really big mission of mine. You were looking at, I sent you my sort of a recently created bio I had to write for my book. And what I realized is a lot of our illness is about loneliness. And when I say loneliness, I mean many things, because you don't have to be alone to be lonely. We can be surrounded by people, we can be surrounded by a community, and we can still feel lonely. And that loneliness can be through the stories we have, through the suffering we're feeling, through a sense of disconnection, right? I mean, there's all kinds of ways that we might feel lonely. And we know that loneliness is actually as, harmful as cigarette smoking, like smoking almost a pack a day. That's the risk, I love how studies are done. I mean, they're so they have to be so dramatic, but listen, it's real, this feeling of loneliness. And I think so many people feel it, that are not even alone, let alone right, the rest of people who are maybe lost their communities or feel, right, like this whole last few years has been so difficult. So, to your point, my real mission is how do we find our way out of that to feel connected and to feel a sense of aliveness. And for me, that's really about understanding that everything is alive, right? That, plants are alive, trees are alive, water is alive, the rocks, all of these things are in this dynamic, intelligent system that is just as intelligent and powerful as our own bodies. And we're in relationship with this incredible life system that we get to be a part of and be supported by, and we engage with. And because we've been conditioned by our education and our society to not see the world as alive, that I think is fundamentally where we feel a sense of loneliness and disconnection, which actually translates even into our microbiome and even into our brain. Do you know that when they look at the neurons of people who are depressed, they are less connected. Connections die off. That's part of what depression, literally our neurons are lonely, in our brains. This is how we are all kind of mirroring inside, outside, this sense of disconnection. So to your point of everything is sacred, there's so many things in our lives that are sacred. It's understanding how fully and deeply we're connected to everything around us. And it's like I'm 4 years old when I go outside. Everything I'm like in a state of awe and wonder. I hear a hawk. You would see me go booking outside right now if I heard a hawk, because even though I live in New York City, I live in a little green part. I keep chickens. I have all my medicinal plants outside, and I hear hawks. I hear owls. I hear coyote. This is like, for me, everything is sacred. And absolutely, I mean, I was just doing an interview with someone the other day who was talking about going to the bathroom, literally like urinating. She's like, I now treat that as a sacred moment, because she's like, I spent so much time in my life not listening to my own body urges. And, how many of us, especially doctors, can relate to that? I mean, she's a doctor. She said, I just go and I say, I am going to enjoy this experience of listening to my body and letting my body do this act. Like, right? Everything can be sacred. Everything can be sacred.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I'm just saying, as you're saying that, it's like, it's one of these things, I think, that it's like you were saying, it's trained out of us. I remember and part of, I think, the story for me personally, and I think others that I've spoken to can relate to, is when like I grew up, I remember walking on the ground and feeling earthworms under the ground, not like stepping on an earthworm, but literally feeling them moving under the dirt. And I remember holding a tree and being able to feel the sap move. And
Mm,
I also have this distinct memory of people telling me I'm crazy and we can't talk like that. And you have to, that's not the way to walk around. Yet then we spend the second part of our lives, or the early quarter, whatever part of your life it is, trying to come back to this connectedness. And I
mm.
think it's this part of it's societally trained disconnection and sterility that really leads to a lot of our chronic illness, because we're separate from, and inside our heart knows that we're truly connected.
Right. Right. Well, and we're in electric, right? There's all this data now about the electrical connection that we're in. Like insects have all these electrical communications, mycelium, right? Like that are connecting the fungi underground, are talking to each other in language, an actual language that they, in the studies that I've read, liken to human, similar to human communication. Mycelium are communicating, right? I mean, and it makes perfect sense to those of us who, right? I remember driving past lots with my mom when I was a little girl and feeling the grief of the trees that had been clear cut when they would be ready to build a house. And I would be like choked up as like a 7-year-old driving by. And I was like, really like feeling and hearing the loss of these trees. And what, like, how do you talk about that in this world? I mean, we're all like in this web of connection, which there's an invisible world around us that's measurable, right? There's some ways we can measure it and some ways we cannot yet, and some ways we never will be able to. And all of that is a very beautiful part of life that we are only now, I think, diving back into, because there was a time when we really understood that science is a language that describes mystery, and there are many other languages that describe mystery. And then science became the only language allowed to describe mystery. It's a great language, but it's got its limitations, and there are many that, I don't know if we should go into right now, but um, you know, mystery is beautiful. Mystery is ceremony. Mystery is, I consider mystery a fundamental need, just as food and water and fresh air and sleep. We need mystery, and we need ecstatic experiences. And by that, I don't mean getting high or anything like that. Just, dance and song and celebration, and ceremony. Because what is ceremony really, just so I can be clear, is it's not about psychedelics or anything like that. Can be. It's a good container for things, and it's a container for transformation. I mean, what we know about ceremony is you go in one way, you don't know what's going to happen during it, and you come out a whole nother way. That's ceremony.
It's so good, because to me I just look at it and we just do these things and we forget just like how powerful it is. And ceremony, to me, the word that comes to mind right away, because it was funny, because I was like, what did I want to say about ceremony? So I just said the word in my head again, but literally the first word that came out is intention. And I think, and the second word is openness to those new possibilities. Because what you were saying is, you go in, and clearly most people I know go into a ceremony, it's a ceremonial intention, but we have to be, but we're not going in trying to determine what the outcome is. And I think the mystery is what's challenging for a lot of people in Lyme and mold. Is like, I think a lot of us are afraid to ask why I have it, because, I don't think it's always just because shit luck or you, and I definitely don't think it's like there's anything wrong with you. It's like, right. And one of the things I wanted to point out, that also spirochetes and ticks communicate the exact same way that humans do, and just the way you did the plants. Now, the research on that's very early, but we know about the chemical communication and then language. But we know that, people who have had post-treatment Lyme disease, at least one person has been able to infect a sterile tick. And so I love the word ecosystem because I actually got sick teaching because this is like so funny how all these things parallel, Maya, is I was teaching, I went to a school for natural resources and landscape ecology. And I was like talking to all the adults and like, how do I get them to love the planet and take action to save it? So it's there for 7 and 27 generations. And it was like, we just want to talk research and then go outside. And so I started teaching kids because I figured if we could get the kids stoked, they're going to take their national passion before we've squished it all and open up to changing the world. And lo and behold, they get Lyme and Babesia. And then I'm like, that's kind of an interesting connection. But I always was talking about our inner relationship with the ecology and the landscape. And so then as a doctor, I've seen everybody looking outside of themselves for healing. And I always wanted to bring them back in to their inner ecosystem. And one of the transformations I've had as we're, getting towards the end of all the recordings for our summit here is that we've all started to really dive into that piece. And as soon as there's this critical mass of people presenting here that talked about that, and then all of a sudden it went back out to our interconnectedness to all again. And that's why this is just such a powerful conversation for me, because it's like literally what you just walked us through has been my experience of recording for this summit. And this is the lesson that we've all wanted to teach you all and share with you, is that connectedness to everything so that we're not lonely. And that everyone's talked about trauma and polyvagal and fight or flight. And I know in the show, in the notes that we were sending back and forth, you said something about cell danger. Everybody's talked about it, but what about keeping it really simple? We're connected to everything, and we've been taught not to be who we are.
Well, yeah, a few thoughts. I mean, one is, it is difficult to be in mystery, right? That's because the other word for mystery can feel like uncertainty, right?
Scary.
And there is a letting go of the process. And sometimes the more we try to control something, actually the worse it goes. That's an interesting phenomenon that can happen. It's happened to me in my personal life, in my health, etc. So that's just one thing, right? Surrender is a really important part of healing, and ceremony, right? And mystery, which is having a sense of trust. And that's not always easy for any number of reasons, whether you're chronically ill, whether you've had really difficult life experiences, there's the gamut, right? And very often those things, go hand in hand as well. But the beauty of surrender, which means letting go of getting from point A to point B, but just kind of putting yourself in the hands of mystery for some period of time or in some way, means you don't have to solve it all by yourself. So that's nice. That's a benefit, right? It's not always easy, but that is part of the narrative. I also wanted to mention, right, because something you said, spirochetes and bacteria and things like that do talk to one another. But in fact, I just did a presentation on the mitobiome, right? That microbes and mitochondria are in conversation. And of course, we now pretty strongly believe in science. This was, of course, very controversial when Lynn Margulies first brought it up, that mitochondria and microbes, spirochetes, in fact, came from the same ancestor, and this is obviously billions of, this is like not in recent time, but they actually, we think, may communicate our mitochondria in our cells and microbes through something called quorum sensing, which is actually how bacteria talk to bacteria. And mitochondria are like, oh, hey, I remember that language, right? Like, so it is very interesting that we have this level of interconnection, and yet, it can go so sideways for some of us at various times. So that's, I think, a really big one. And I think, gosh, I'm not sure I remember what your question was, but yeah, I mean, I think the whole piece of the interconnectedness is really where our answers are. Oh, I know, because we were talking about the cell danger response, right? You were saying cell danger and trauma and polyvagal. So here's what I've come to as a neurologist, that all healing of the nervous system really begins with the heart. And that is, I think, where I always go is it's not about like regulating our nervous, it's like not about more control, right? It's actually about feeling our emotions and using the heart as a sensing organ, right? A perceiving organ, which we know from, the Heart Math Institute, that our hearts are more than just like pumps, pumping stuff. They have these electromagnetic fields. They perceive, they project a field that reflects how we're feeling. We have combined fields with trees and with the earth and with each other, with animals. Like we're in this whole ocean of this electromagnetic field, and our hearts actually know things before our brains know them. If you have an EKG measuring heart activity and an EEG measuring brain activity, your heart responds to a stimulus before your brain. Like your heart has intelligence. So really, like, we could start with feeling and perceiving and sensing, and not like thinking and controlling and holding on really tight. Like sometimes that's where, and that's why I consider song to be medicine. I consider meditation to be medicine. I consider dance to be medicine. I consider stories to be medicine, which I know you do too, because it gets you out of here. I mean, we've got nice brains. I'm not knocking it. I'm a neurologist, but like, I think this is where it's at in terms of, and we talk about the gut brain. I'm like, well, what about the heart brain?
Dude,
The
right?
heart-
Everybody's like the gut brain axis. I'm like, what about the other organ with its own autonomic nervous system that actually trumps both of them? It's called the gut, should be the heart with the brain and the gut. But
Right.
and it's
Yeah.
funny because even when I try to say it, I'm like the gut brain heart axis. I'm like, no, it's actually the heart, and put the other two in whatever order you want.
Right.
I'm so glad you said that. And it's interesting too. It's just like, I know that like all of the different things we talk about, people are like, they talk about safe and sound and all these other ways and this limbic retraining. I'm like, the first step is, you've just highlighted so much for us, is just get into feeling and perceiving with your heart. And I think that people get afraid to open up their heart because they don't want to be harmed. I'm like, well, even if your heart is closed, you're still getting harmed. So you might as well have this chance. I mean, Isaac Elias, who quite well too, was talking about how the heart's the only thing that takes whatever you give to it, processes it with the energetic connection to the universe, and cleans, and through its action cleans the blood ultimately, but then it redistributes it. But the first thing it nourishes is itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then it takes care of everything else. And so that's what I love about all the things you were just saying. I mean, I could just all day long. This is like church for me, because it's like the neuroscience, it's the real healing, and it's the reason that we're sick and the way we can access healing it. And I don't think I hear you saying you don't ever, like you said, it's not that you don't use meds and herbs. Our beautiful brains have figured out how to interact with the environment and bring these into our thing. But the first place we should start is at home. Mm-hmm. And then move out. And so one of the things that I think is so cool about the work you're doing is, and we've sort of touched on it a little bit, but I really wanted to just give you the chance to really dive into this, is quantum healing. Mm-hmm. And we've talked a lot about plants. And then I think that a lot of people, when we're talking about plant medicine for healing, think we're talking about psychedelics, right? And you've clearly talked about all kinds of things, from the macrodose psychedelic experience with a guide to the micro doses that you may barely even notice, but they lead to shifts, especially and probably definitively needing to have a guide with you. Because I just remember Mary Morrissey always said to me when I did some training with her, it's like, you can't see the picture from within the frame. It's so hard. Like, the right answers, but it's really hard to be your own doctor or your own guide. So that's why we have communities like this. But one of the things you talk about is using the master plants and quantum healing. And I think this is one of the most unique approaches to utilizing the intelligent and healing nature of plants and touching on their sacredness. And also, like, having experienced this, in fact, right before we even started, I mean, I've got mine right here, but what is this? I mean, this stuff is like everyone in my family, including my daughter, as soon as I came back where I saw you present on these and you shared, use them and had, their own experience. But what is this and what's going on here? Because
Mm.
this is so unique, Maya. I mean, I actually want to know someday where it all came from. I'm pretty sure I get it, but
It came from the plants. So I, of course, um, you know, I grow master plants. P.S. That's legal. It's legal, everything I do with them. But I grow an ayahuasca vine. I grow who's over 10 years old. I grow San Pedro cacti. I work with these plants, just tending them. I don't consume them. I tend them, and that's part of my relationship because I do consider these to be teachers and masters, and they teach me as I take care of them. And so this was really an idea that was transmitted to me from them is the best I can really explain it. I mean, we could get more into it, but really, when I was studying in indigenous communities from elders, they actually they don't believe you need to ingest the plant in order to experience the healing of the plant. They actually even sing songs called icaros, or like medicine songs, you could think of them, that are transmitted from the plants. And that is considered as strong as ingesting the plant. So they're not about the compound. They're, we have like the 5-HT2A receptor and the serotonin, they're like, this is the plant spirit, or kind of the energy or the mother of the plant that transmits vibrational medicine through the voice, right? So the plants really, for me, just showed the way to how we can infuse their medicine into drops that do not have alcohol, are made from structured spring water that comes directly from the spring. It's not even shipped from far away, and organic glycol, and charged basically in ceremony, made in ceremony in the presence of the plant, but without plant matter, and made with my medicine songs that were transmitted to me in ceremony with an altar, gems, stones, etc. And even where it's bottled, I was very lucky to meet an amazing scientist who has his own facility. And he said, "Oh, you're going to want an altar, right?" He's like, "I'm a master carpenter. I'll build a table." And it's the permanent altar table in the bottling area with an altar that I sent him. And he put there, sent me pictures, puts the water there to charge. We have prisms with rainbows in the room. He's like so down. He actually plays the medicine songs while it's being bottled. So every step from beginning to end is made in ceremony. And of course, because I'm a doctor and, excuse my language, but I do have like a real bullshit detector. I was like, I mean, okay, I know that this was guided information, but is it real? Is it really real? And I started to work with it for a long time with myself and then with my students and clients at retreats and things like that. And it was so transformative. It was so potent, but not like it because it caused people to trip, but it was just because it opened, what I call sensory gating, so that like they were able to perceive more and experience plasticity, but without it being like some big, shocking, dysregulating experience. Because for some people, even if they wanted to do psychedelics, even if they were everywhere and it was legal and it was easy to access and there were guides, it would be too much for them. Or they would have, right, if you're sober, or if you're pregnant, or if you're a child, or if you are on a lot of meds, or if you are super sensitive, right? Which is, well, me, I'm sensitive. And my whole practice was, I would say these are people who hear a bird sneeze 3 miles away, right? So
right.
not everybody's like ready to run out and have a big experience. And some people just don't want to. And this is a way to engage with the healing of these plants in a way that is transformative, but also, right, and powerful, but also gentle.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think that sensory gating is such an interesting idea, because that's kind of been my experience. It's like, just like, wow, And there's just that thing that you need,
Mhm.
where there's this little bit of shift in your perception. And this is what the quantum piece is. It's not, I think that it's so funny. I remember like a meditation retreat I went on where I'm like, all these people are crying out and they're having these psycho experiences and people are telling me about all these visions. And I'm like, yeah, that's not how it is for me. It's just like, but the thing is, maybe it's just my mindset and my lens, because I know there's research on that. But it's like kind of one of the pieces is just like I was just connected to everything and nothing all at once. And I'm like, that was so liberating. And I'm like, I don't need to like, have this physically exhausting experience. I don't need to be up all night. I mean, we did start at 4 a.m. So I mean, we were taking advantage of our natural melatonin, but I mean, but you're like, it's fun. It's very interesting how different people need different treatments. And then I'm always like, I really recommend people work with people like yourself and other people who are experts in this area and who are guides, because I know a lot of my friends and then also just acquaintances who think they need something. And that's a lot of times utilizing this thing or their party center and not going back to their heart. And so that's really where you're trying to figure out, of any of these plants or these other experiences, what is it? And actually, I just thought of this literally right this moment. The weekend after we recently hung out and you shared the quantum drop, I took them with me and I was doing a couple lectures, and I used them a little bit and really just doing my breath work and seeing how things were different. And then every morning, like, because like, they of course they put the not morning person lecturing first. I was like, I started turning on my evening music in the morning.
Mm.
And then I started dancing like before, during, and after my shower. And I love dancing, but it's like I don't usually think about doing it in the morning. I'm like, oh, I gotta wait for my coffee. And it was like coffee's brewing. I haven't had it. I'm just like dancing. I'm like, oh yeah. And it was like so liberating. And I felt, and you know me, I mean, I'll talk like this all day long. So I'm okay on stage, just like you. It's like because we're sharing our passion with others, but it was a different connection to the audience, and the message I felt just really came out. And I don't know why I started dancing in the morning. And now I kind of have a sense, right? It's really interesting because sometimes we don't make the connection. And then a lot of what I try to have people do is not necessarily try to make connections and let them come to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's an incredible story. I'm going to get that as a testimonial. So afterwards.
It's totally real. Holy shit.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. I love that you shared that, because that's actually the way these work, right? As opposed to what I call like, the fireworks and, cannonballs effect is, we get to have these moments like this, which are these like epiphany moments where we're like, wait a minute, I just like met this incredible person that's like, I feel part of my soul family. Like, where did they show up from? Or I just had this incredible download. Like, gosh, like, I can't believe it. And then someone will be like, oh yeah, like I've been taking the quantum drops and like, I've had all these shifts. And it's sort of, it's not like you get to have this big sledgehammer experience and then attribute everything to that, but like it's subtle and it unfolds. And part of it is not just having that sensory gating open where you can perceive healing opportunities and other opportunities that might not be available to you because you can't see them. You literally can't perceive them, even if they're right there. But it's also you're in relationship with a master teacher, with an ancient teacher. So you are going to be guided with their help, right? That's like the beauty. And actually, I'll say one of the ways that I really started to understand that this quantum relationships begins, how it begins, and I watched it begin, was people would reach out to me because they had questions about microdosing or questions about going to a ceremony or that kind of thing. And they'd say, can I ask you questions? I'm interested. And what I noticed in these coaching experiences I would do with them would be their lives would already start changing in these really big ways, and healing would already be happening. All they had done was just thought about it, right? And that's because it's a relationship. It's not, the relationship is the medicine. Ingesting it can be one way to do the relationship. Quantum dosing can be one way. Growing the plant and tending it can be one way. looking at pictures of the plants can be a way you start to engage in all of these ways of being in relationship with the plants, is how you start to experience the healing. So the minute, if you're like hearing this conversation and you're like, ooh, I'm so interested, the relationship has begun, right? It's like you're already in a healing relationship with a master teacher.
Wow. That's like, I mean, and it's so funny because like, I'm it's so funny that I would just like grab the little bottle of the children and like, and I was just like, I was so excited for the conversation, but I had literally not even thought of that. I've talked to other people about since that time dancing in the morning and everything, but it's just like, as soon as you start thinking about it, it is. And that's why I'm always like, be careful, or well, be aware, probably much better term to use, of the relationships you're in. And that's where like labeling ourselves, maybe we want to change our language. And I'm a big proponent, just like as we were talking about rewriting our story, you can actually rewind and just restate what you just said. I'm just like, become aware. Don't be, it's like it's a completely different thing. I don't even remember what other word I just used a second ago because I rewrote it into one that I prefer. And so it's like when we're looking at our healing journey and what's worked or not worked on sort of a physical, sort of medical objective plane, just be aware and don't be so mad about Lyme. I mean, Lyme's been around for at least 13 million years, and other similar infections have been around for over 100 million years. They predate us by a whole bunch, just like all these plants do. There's wisdom. And I find it one of the, it's so funny. I haven't thought of this in a really long time either. Is one of the things I think that Lyme is so good at infecting people chronically is because it doesn't fight with the present moment. It doesn't fight the reality of the situation. If you're trying to kill it, it chills out. If not, it takes advantage of things. And I'm not saying that we should just leave it in our bodies by any stretch, but we can learn so much by the wisdom of these organisms that have been around for a while. And just imagine if you had a relationship with Lyme where you're like, you're awesome, I learned a lot, I don't want you in me anymore, please leave. And you're on your way out, but I also respect you for the knowledge that you carry. And also you can leave my body, please. It's just a different approach.
Yeah, I think, and I don't know if I should be dropping something potentially controversial at kind of near the end of our conversation, but
I know, right? You can though.
he's like, uh-oh. I've had Lyme. I've treated a lot of Lyme for probably a lot longer than most neurologists because, they didn't think Lyme was the thing. They treated for like whatever, 10 days and that was it. So that's how I was trained. But my belief is Lyme could be part of our microbiome probably, and in a really, right, in a really not in out of control levels, but I don't really think any of it 100% leaves our body. I think there's some amount that's probably part of our inherent community of microbes. We know we have viruses, we know we have parasites, we know we have all kinds of microbes, and they're very diverse. It's not to say we just let Lyme take over. No, absolutely not. But I love, right, because I think we are in a very us versus them mentality when it comes to, particularly when it comes to what we think of as infections. And again, it doesn't mean we just say, oh, overtake me, that's not the point. But it's also like when we're fighting, right, because it's our own selves, right? It's sort of like the war on mentality is what I call it. And I write about it in my book actually, because, when you talk about like, maybe we can like send love in that direction. And it doesn't mean like walk all over me. It just means like, I know you're a part of me. I know you're here for a reason. I would like for the lesson to be learned so we can go back into right relationship where you're not causing me the harm that I'm currently experiencing, and we can be in balance, whatever that means. And really like, instead of that feeling of like, oh, I hate this, right? Like, right. I always think, and I mean, excuse my language, when people are like, fuck cancer, I get it, but it's like that attitude, that energy that is like separating us from us, I think actually drives that loneliness, that separation, that disconnectedness that I think is very much at the root of illness of all kinds, right? Stuckness, sickness, sadness. Like, so part of it is, can we kind of get into that place? And by the way, I know that Stephen Buhner, who's a big, had a whole bunch of books on the herbs of Lyme and so on, and many people found his work very helpful. He passed away recently, but he was a very big proponent of the idea of sending love, right? And being like, hey, you little intelligent creatures, like, wow, you've done an amazing job of being successful in what you're doing, but can we change it up? Like,
get a more balanced relationship.
Yeah. I mean, listen, I don't think it can hurt. Like, what would happen if, I'll tell you one last story, which is not about Lyme, but it's relevant to this topic. I teach my students how to actually, we talk about plant consciousness and how, the plants' brains are really underground. And if you think of plants, right, they're upside down, actually. Their neural networks are their root systems, and that we can communicate with them. And one of my students had a passion flower plant, and it had never made fruit. And so after doing one of our exercises, she said, I tried something. I went to my passion flower plant and I said, beautiful, beautiful passion flower plant. You make such beautiful flowers, but you've never given me fruit. Would you please give me fruit? And a few weeks, months, I don't know how long it took. It wasn't that long later, she came on a call and said, my passion flower is making fruit. For the first time in years and years, I got fruit. And it was soon after she asked. And it just, I have so many stories I could share like that, but I think like that's the energy. I think that it's worth experimenting and being playful, right? Just with like, what if I took a different approach? What if I brought a different energy or told a different story or asked in a different way? What that's stuck for me or that's causing me suffering, what might shift? Like, because play and experimenting is actually, right, like we learn so much more quickly and we change so much more effectively when we do it through play.
It's so interesting and so perfect, because like usually I'll say one thing is like everything you just said about Lyme, like I totally agree, because a lot of people feel like it can't even get out of our body. It's not about that. It's about that balanced relationship. And I'm just not even gonna, everybody watches this knows I need to re-summarize everything because I really want to hit home with like the sledgehammer, like this is such a good point. You said it so perfectly. I got nothing. That is literally like my heart speaking and hearing you. And like, it is so important. This is the message that we made the summit for, is about healing. And healing does not include the word fighting. And so Maya, I'm just so honored and blessed to have you as part of this summit. And I would love for you to, I know that you've got the Dirt Cure that's been out, and then the new book is just come out when the summit's airing. So that's the Master Plan Experience, the Science, Safety, and Sacred Ceremony of Psychedelics. But if others, I'm sure there's going to be like pretty much everybody watching this and everybody they share it with is going to be like, I need to reach out and learn more about Dr. Майя Шетрит. Where can they connect with you and learn more about the work you're doing?
The best place to go is drmaya.com, drmaya.com. And I have a ton of free resources and practices that are just videos, and my book's there, the quantum drops are there, a lot of other just free materials. So, and I love hearing from people, so feel free to reach out.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, what an honor. It's so fun.
Yeah, it's always so much fun. Thank you so much for having me, Tom.
Yeah. And everyone, thanks for joining us for this episode of the Healing from Lyme Disease Summit. I hope that we gave you this opportunity, both in this conversation and all the conversations of the summit, to see illness and health from a different perspective, open your hearts so that you can really receive like the true meaning of healing and go on your own unique journey to that next level, whatever that means in your life. And so from all of us here at the team, just want to send lots of love to you. We greatly appreciate you joining us. And until next time, Dr. Tom Moorcroft, we'll see you soon.